12 feet, that was all that separated them. A former president, leaning forward with a smirk carved into his face, and a congresswoman, spine straight, eyes unblinking, her notes resting calmly in her hands. The stage lights burned hot, the cameras zoomed in, and an auditorium packed with students and reporters held its breath, waiting for a clash no one could predict. Then it happened. Donald Trump's voice dropped, sharp and cutting, as he hurled the word no microphone should ever have captured. An insult born of centuries, spat across a stage on live television. A gasp broke from the crowd. One girl in the front row reached for her phone, her hands trembling. The silence that followed felt violent, as if the whole country had been slapped at once. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She did not blink. She leaned forward, folding her hands as if steadying the entire room, and answered with a calm so piercing it turned insult into mirror. In that instant, it wasn't just Trump she was facing. It was history itself. And as you watch this unfold, remember, what follows is a dramatized retelling, a story shaped to carry truth through fiction. The words may be imagined, but the weight is real, the humiliation, the dignity, the fight to turn silence into strength. So ask yourself, when power throws its ugliest weapon across the table, what does it mean for one voice, steady and unbroken, to throw it right back? The air inside the Texas State University auditorium carried a strange electricity, not the wild chanting of a campaign rally, not the polite murmur of a lecture hall, but something heavier. It was the kind of energy that made people sit forward in their seats without realizing it, the kind that made even the hum of the overhead lights sound sharper. Reporters adjusted their earpieces, students shifted restlessly, and a handful of professors traded quiet, uneasy glances. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be another routine town hall. The cameras were already rolling, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Thick cables ran across the floor in neat coils, and stage hands whispered instructions from the shadows. At the front of the stage, two chairs faced each other at a deliberate distance, 12 feet. It was close enough for confrontation, far enough for tension. Between them sat a modest wooden table with 2 glasses of water, untouched, almost symbolic. Then he entered, Donald J. Trump moved onto the stage the way he always had, chin tilted high, jacket buttoned tight across his chest, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. He waved to the crowd, slow and deliberate, as if the evening had already been decided in his favor. The applause from his supporters was immediate and loud, but scattered, drowned out by a heavier silence from the rest of the room. He relished it anyway, basking under the glare of the spotlights like a boxer stepping into the ring. Moments later, she appeared. Jasmine Crockett stepped onto the stage in a navy pantsuit that seemed to sharpen every movement. She didn't wave, didn't nod, didn't try to charm the cameras. She simply walked to her chair with quiet confidence, placed her notes neatly on the table, and sat down. Where Trump's presence filled the room with bluster, Jasmine's arrival carved the air with precision. Her posture was straight, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Students in the first few rows whispered to each other, sensing the contrast as if 2 storms were gathering from opposite ends of the stage. The moderator cleared his throat, shuffling his cards with trembling fingers. He tried to smile, but it looked more like a grimace. He reminded the audience that the evening's theme was racial unity and economic justice. The words rang almost ironic now, fragile against the weight of what everyone expected was coming. For the first few minutes, the exchange seemed almost civil. Trump delivered his usual talking points, boasting of numbers, jobs, achievements. Jasmine listened, pen poised above her notes, not interrupting, only waiting. And then she leaned forward slightly, her voice carrying across the hall with a clarity that sliced through the air. "Mr. President," she began, her tone firm but even, "you've spoken often of your support for law enforcement, but how do you reconcile that with the rise in wrongful detentions, particularly of Black men, In states where your endorsements have shaped leadership? The room stilled. Students froze mid-breath. The moderator glanced up quickly, as if he hadn't expected her to go there so soon. Reporters raised their pens, ready. And across from her, Trump's smile faltered for the briefest second before returning. Sharper, tighter. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Not just policy, not just politics. It was the opening move in a duel, and everyone in that auditorium knew they were about to witness more than answers. They were about to witness a collision. Trump leaned back in his chair, lips curling into that half smirk he'd worn on debate stages for years. He gave a small wave of his hand, dismissive, like brushing away an annoying fly. "We've done more for the black community than anyone since Abraham Lincoln," he said, his voice thick with self-congratulation. "You should be grateful." A few scattered claps came from the back of the auditorium, but they died quickly in the silence that followed. Jasmine's eyes flickered down to her notes for half a second, then lifted again, sharp and unwavering. "Gratitude doesn't replace justice, Mr. President," she replied evenly. "The numbers don't lie, and what I'm asking you—" She never finished the sentence. Trump leaned forward, chin jutting out, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate growl. The words slithered out, meant to cut beneath the microphones, meant to stay in the shadows, but the microphones caught everything. "Shut your mouth, ape!" The silence that followed was instant, suffocating. It wasn't the hush of politeness. It was the kind of silence that feels like glass shattering in slow motion. A gasp burst from somewhere in the third row. The moderator's mouth opened slightly, as though he might intervene, but no sound came out. A student in the front clutched her phone with trembling hands, already recording, her breath audible in the device's tiny microphone. The cameraman, trained to keep steady, hesitated for the briefest moment, lens quivering before holding firm. Jasmine blinked once. That was all. Her pen, poised above the notepad, stilled in midair. She did not flinch. She did not recoil. She looked across the 12 feet of stage as if she had been expecting this all along, as if the insult was not a surprise but a sad inevitability. Her hands folded together on the table, steadying themselves like anchors in a storm. When she spoke, her voice was measured, not rising above the calm cadence she had carried since the beginning. "Mr. President," she said, each word deliberate. "I wasn't raised to match ignorance with silence, but I was taught that when someone shows you who they are, you listen." She paused, her gaze never breaking from his. "And America just did." The words settled like thunder rolling across a wide plain. No shouting, no grand gestures, just stillness and truth. For a heartbeat, the auditorium seemed to stop breathing. And then, slowly, the shift began. Heads turned, eyes widened, murmurs rippled through the crowd. A professor near the aisle clasped his hand to his mouth. A reporter scribbled furiously, pen scratching across the page. Students who had come expecting a routine political spar now found themselves witnesses to something raw and unforgettable. Trump sat back in his chair, jaw tight, face unreadable in the bright glare of the lights. He acted as though nothing had happened, but the room had changed. The audience had changed. And as Jasmine leaned back in her chair, calm and composed, the weight of what had just been spoken, both his words and hers, hung in the air like smoke that would not clear. Everyone knew it. This was no longer just a town hall. It was a moment America would carry far beyond these walls. By the time Jasmine stepped off the stage and disappeared into the green room, the moment was no longer confined to Texas State University. It was already slipping through the cracks of the internet, carried by shaky hands and glowing screens. A 22-second clip, the insult, the silence, her reply, began to circulate on Twitter before the program had even ended. The video wasn't polished. It wasn't edited. It was raw, grainy, and unfiltered. But that was exactly what made it electric. Phones buzzed in dorm rooms from Santa Barbara to Syracuse. In one student lounge, a group huddled around a cracked iPhone screen, replaying the insult again and again, eyes widening each time Jasmine's voice cut back with calm precision. A veteran in rural Oklahoma watched from his recliner, remote forgotten in his hand. He had voted Republican every cycle since 1980, but now he turned to his wife and muttered, "That was wrong, all of it. And that woman, she handled it better than I would have." In Oakland, a high school senior named Jania sat on the couch with her mother. As Trump's voice echoed from the television, Jania's eyes filled with something between disbelief and rage. "I've never seen anyone talk back like that," she whispered. Her mother didn't answer. She just wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered back. She didn't even blink. In churches, pastors previewing their Sunday sermons froze mid-paragraph, staring at the replay of the exchange. In barbershops and diners, strangers leaned over booths and counters to share the clip. Even in households where politics was usually avoided, the words found their way into living rooms, forcing conversations at dinner tables across America. And the media, always hungry for spectacle, couldn't ignore it. Within an hour, the clip rolled on cable news loops, anchors fumbling for words that matched the gravity of what had been said. Some networks bleeped Trump's insult, others didn't, and the ones that aired it raw, without filters, without euphemisms, saw their numbers spike as if the nation itself couldn't turn away. But something else happened too. The coverage shifted. Commentators didn't just replay the ugliness of the insult. They replayed Jasmine's response. They lingered on her stillness, on the way her words seemed less like a comeback and more like a verdict. One anchor said softly, almost with awe, "She looked presidential." Another panelist nodded, adding, "For the first time in a long time, the adult in the room wasn't the one with the title." On Twitter, hashtags piled up. "Listen to her. She did not flinch. Presidential." The last one caught fire quickly, carrying her name alongside it, trending in cities she had never visited. To many, it felt like the nation had been handed a mirror. Ugly on one side, unshakable on the other. Back in the green room, Jasmine sat quietly on a worn leather couch, the buzz of her phone relentless. Her communications director, Tasha, held up the screen, eyes wide. "Jazz, it's everywhere," she said, her voice almost a whisper. On the display was a single word beneath Jasmine's face, repeated thousands of times in bold white text against black: presidential. The insult had been meant to diminish her. Instead, it had crowned her. The door to the green room clicked shut behind her, and for the first time all night, Jasmine Crockett was out of the spotlight. The muffled roar of the auditorium still pulsed through the walls, but here the air was cooler, quieter, filled only with the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of her phone on the couch beside her. She lowered herself into the worn leather cushions, spine straight at first, then slowly melting into the fatigue she'd kept hidden on stage. Across from her, Tasha paced with her phone in hand, her eyes darting across the glowing screen. Notifications stacked faster than she could swipe them away. Hashtags, mentions, news alerts. Raw clips reposted with captions like, "She didn't flinch, and this is leadership." Every few seconds, the phone vibrated again, the sound sharp in the silence of the small room. "Jazz," Tasha finally said, her voice carrying both awe and disbelief. "It's everywhere. Twitter, TikTok, even Facebook." "Look." She turned the screen around. Dozens of posts scrolled by, each replaying the insult, each replaying Jasmine's reply. On some, her face was frozen mid-sentence, lips parted, eyes steady. On others, bold words flashed across the video. "America just did." Jasmine exhaled slowly, letting her head fall back against the couch. Her earrings brushed the leather as she closed her eyes for a beat. When she spoke, her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "I wasn't trying to go viral." Tasha stopped pacing, lowered her phone, and studied her friend. Then, quietly but firmly, she answered, "You didn't. Truth did." The words hung between them, heavier than the buzz of the phone, heavier than the news alerts piling up by the second. Jasmine opened her eyes again, staring at the ceiling tiles as though searching for a pattern in the dots and lines above her. Her shoulders ached from hours of tension, her jaw still tight from holding back the instinct to react on stage. Exhaustion washed over her in waves, but beneath it, something else flickered. Responsibility. She could feel it pressing against her skin, sharper than the lights she had just left, louder than the insult she had just endured. Viral fame wasn't what she wanted. She knew how quickly it could become spectacle, how easily a moment could be chewed up and spat out by the 24-hour news cycle. Yet this felt different. It wasn't just the insult being replayed. It was her silence, her restraint, her words. Tasha sat down beside her, finally still, and placed the phone on the table between them. The screen lit up again, hashtags scrolling by like ticker tape. Presidential. She did not flinch. Listen to her. Jasmine reached for the glass of water, the condensation slick against her fingers. She took a slow sip, then set it back down. Her voice was steady, but quieter now, as though she was speaking more to herself than to Tasha. If this many people are listening, we can't waste it. For the first time that evening, Tasha saw not just her exhaustion, but the flicker of resolve behind it. Jasmine wasn't smiling, wasn't celebrating. She was bracing, not for the insult she'd already endured, but for everything that was about to come. While Jasmine sat in silence backstage, the rest of America was already talking, in living rooms and kitchens, in church basements and classroom halls. The 22 seconds of footage replayed over and over again, each viewing pulling new gasps, new tears, new conversations. It wasn't just another political clip. It was something raw, something people couldn't easily explain, but also couldn't look away from. In a modest home in Oakland, a teenager named Janya sat cross-legged on the couch with her mother. They had planned to watch just the opening of the town hall before finishing dinner, but now the food on their plates had gone cold. When Trump's voice filled the screen with a slur, Jania's body tensed, her fork clattering onto the coffee table. Her mother reached for the remote but stopped as Jasmine's calm reply cut through the room. By the time Jasmine said, "America just did," Janya's mother had tears streaking down her face. "She didn't even blink," she whispered, her voice breaking. For Janya, who had never seen a politician look like her and stand that firm, the words were something closer to a shield. Hundreds of miles away, in a quiet farmhouse in rural Oklahoma, Thomas, a retired Army veteran, leaned forward in his recliner. He had voted Republican since 1980 and prided himself on loyalty. But as the clip replayed, he felt something shift. "That was wrong," he muttered under his breath, staring at the screen as if willing the words to change. His wife, sitting beside him with her knitting needles paused midair, asked softly, "And her? What do you think of her?" Thomas hesitated, the weight of decades pressing on him. Finally, he admitted, "She handled it better than I would have." In Detroit, a group of college students huddled in a dorm common room, the glow of a laptop reflecting on their faces. They had gathered for a study session, but ended up watching the clip on loop. "She didn't raise her voice," one student said, shaking his head. "She didn't need to," another added. "That's what power looks like. Not the insult, the response." For the first time in weeks, the group set aside their textbooks and began talking about registering voters, about showing up, about finding their own voices. Even inside church halls, the footage disrupted routine. A pastor in Atlanta, rehearsing his Sunday sermon, stopped mid-sentence when an aide showed him the clip on a phone. He watched in silence, lips pressed tight, then placed the phone down gently on his Bible. That Sunday, he set aside his prepared sermon and preached instead about dignity in the face of insult, about how silence can thunder louder than rage. The congregation wept, some nodding, others clutching each other's hands. From kitchen tables to classrooms, the pattern repeated. Parents found themselves explaining old wounds to their children, and children saw their parents cry for the first time in years. Strangers struck up conversations in grocery store lines, no longer talking about gas prices or football, but about what it meant to face hatred without bending. The insult had begun as a weapon hurled across a stage, but as it traveled through the nation's screens and hearts, it became something else entirely, a mirror. And as Americans looked into it, some for the first time in a long while asked themselves, what do we truly see staring back at us? The highway stretched long and quiet as Jasmine drove herself back to Texarkana, the glow of the dashboard clock her only companion. She kept the radio off, letting the silence settle around her like a second skin. The roar of the town hall still echoed in her ears, but now it blended with the steady hum of tires on asphalt. Each mile pulled her further from the cameras, closer to something older, something truer, home. By the time she pulled into the gravel driveway of her parents' one-story house, the porch light was already on. The wooden screen door creaked open, and her mother stood waiting, arms crossed, chin tilted slightly upward in that way Jasmine had known since childhood. Inside, the smell of cornbread and cabbage clung to the air. The table set for three, though her father was still at the barber shop finishing a late trim for a neighbor. Jasmine set her bag down by the door, kissed her mother's cheek, and slid into her old seat at the kitchen table. Her mother poured sweet tea into a glass and placed it in front of her. "You look tired," she said simply. Jasmine managed a faint smile. "You look like you've been reading comments online," she replied. For the first time that night, her mother allowed a small laugh, but her eyes stayed serious. "Baby, sometimes you don't get to choose whether you're a symbol. Sometimes the choice is made for you." Not long after, the back door opened and her father stepped in, boots heavy with the dust of the day, the faint scent of peppermint and shaving cream trailing him. He washed his hands at the sink, then joined them at the table. For a long moment, he said nothing, just studied his daughter with the same steady gaze she had carried on stage hours earlier. Finally, he spoke. "I served with men who called me the same word he called you. They wore the same uniform I did. They fought beside me but wouldn't eat beside me." His jaw clenched as he reached for his tea. Hearing him say it on that stage tonight, it brought it all back. Jasmine's throat tightened, but she stayed still, staring at the condensation sliding down her glass. Her mother reached across the table, not to coddle, but to anchor her hand over Jasmine's. "What you did out there wasn't just strong," she said quietly. "It was clear. You showed them you don't need to yell to make a man shake." For a moment, the three of them sat in silence, the weight of years pressing against the walls of the small kitchen. Then Jasmine spoke, her voice softer than before. "When I was 11, she began, eyes fixed on the tablecloth. "Coach Waller called me a smart little monkey after I beat two boys in the spelling bee." Her parents looked at her, startled. Jasmine swallowed hard. "I didn't tell anyone. I thought if I kept it inside, maybe it wouldn't become real. But it did. It shaped me." Her mother's grip tightened slightly. Her father's eyes darkened with something between anger and sorrow. For the first time that night, Jasmine let the memory breathe in the room. It was the twist of truth she hadn't shared with anyone. The proof that the wound didn't begin on stage in Texas State, but decades earlier, and that each insult carried the weight of 1,000 echoes. The apartment lights burned past midnight for 3 nights straight, stacks of takeout boxes crowding the dining table now converted into a war room. Jasmine's team sat scattered in chairs and on the couch, Tasha with her laptop balanced on her knees, Roman flipping restlessly through polling reports, Greg tapping a pen against his legal pad. Outside, Fort Worth was quiet, the streets nearly empty, but inside, the air was thick with argument. "We can't let this moment slip," Greg insisted, leaning forward as if willing Jasmine to agree. "You should be on every network tomorrow morning. The View, CBS, MSNBC. Strike while the iron's hot." His voice rose with urgency, the pen tapping faster. Roman shook his head. "If she jumps into interviews now, they'll frame it like a feud. Trump versus Crockett. He insults. She responds. Media eats it up. That's not the story we want. Tasha looked up from her screen, her voice softer but cutting through the noise. The question is, do we want this to be a moment or the beginning of something bigger? All eyes turned to Jasmine. She sat at the head of the table, her journal open in front of her, the ink on the page still wet from the words she'd written earlier. This is not about vengeance. This is about vision. She traced the line slowly with her finger, as though grounding herself in it. The exhaustion from the town hall still lingered in her bones, but beneath it pulsed something sharper. Resolve. She finally spoke. If we chase the spotlight now, we'll be reduced to a headline. I don't want to be remembered for clapping back. I want to be remembered for pointing forward. The room quieted. Even Greg, who thrived on momentum, let the pen drop still against his pad. So what's the plan then? Roman asked cautiously. Jasmine closed her journal, the leather cover snapping softly. We do it on our terms. One stage, one mic, one speech. Live, unedited. No pundits cutting it into pieces. Just truth. Tasha tilted her head. Where? A faint smile flickered across Jasmine's lips as she answered. Texas Southern University. That's where I found my voice the first time, when I stood in front of a room full of students and told them that respect shouldn't be radical. If I speak again, it has to be there. Her team exchanged glances, the weight of her choice settling in. It wasn't the safe move. It wasn't the quick one, but it was unmistakably hers. Greg leaned back, exhaling as if conceding. All right, Texas Southern, but we'll need security, press coordination, live stream setup. Keep it simple. Jasmine cut in gently. This isn't about staging. It's about honesty. If people show up, let them. If cameras roll, let them. But the speech has to be mine. No slogans, no scripts, just truth. The decision was made, and the room seemed to exhale with her. For the first time that week, Jasmine felt clarity pushing through the fog. The insult had set a fire, but it would be her vision that carried the flame. The auditorium at Texas Southern was filled beyond capacity. Students leaned against walls, crowded onto stairwells, and pressed shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. Outside, speakers had been mounted for the overflow crowd spilling into the courtyard, their faces lit by phone screens as they waited for the moment to begin. But inside, just before Jasmine appeared, the atmosphere was thick with anticipation. Not the noisy kind, but the quiet hum of hundreds of people holding their breath at the same time. When she finally stepped onto the stage, the room rose with her, not in thunderous applause, not in raucous cheers, but in the solemn, collective way a congregation stands when a pastor enters the pulpit. Jasmine didn't wave, didn't smile, didn't try to charm. She walked with calm precision to the podium, set her notes down, and let her gaze move slowly across the hall. The silence deepened. Even the cameras seemed to wait. She began softly, almost conversationally. I wasn't planning to give a speech tonight, she said, her voice steady but low. But when your name becomes a headline and your dignity becomes a debate, you don't stay quiet. The words rippled outward, carried by the microphones, but felt like they belonged to each person in the room. Her rhythm built gradually, weaving personal story with historical truth. When I was 11, I was called something meant to shrink me after I won a spelling bee. When my mother went for a job interview in 1978, she was asked whether she'd worked in the house or the fields. When my grandfather walked the streets of Arkansas, he had to step off the sidewalk every time a white woman passed. That word, that insult, was never new. Not to me, not to us. Students shifted in their seats, some wiping at their eyes, others whispering quiet hms of agreement. Jasmine never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Each sentence landed with the rhythm of truth, steady and unbroken, the kind of cadence that made listeners lean forward rather than recoil. And that night, on that stage, I wasn't speaking for applause or performance. I was speaking because silence would have told too many little girls, too many young men, too many families that when power insults you, you have nothing to say. I refuse to pass on that lie. Her eyes moved over the crowd, catching the faces of students who had never lived the histories she named but carried their echoes. She let a pause linger, drawing breath, before delivering the line that would reverberate far beyond these walls. "If you want to shake a man who lives on noise," she said clearly, "you hit him with stillness." The hall seemed to quake in that stillness. For a moment, no one moved, no one coughed, no one rustled. Then the silence broke into a rising wave, not explosive, but deliberate, like a drum beat building strength with each clap. The audience wasn't celebrating. They were affirming. Jasmine let the sound wash over her hands resting lightly on the podium, her expression calm. She had not shouted. She had not cursed. She had simply told the truth. And in doing so, she had given the crowd, and the country beyond it, a language they hadn't known they were waiting to hear. For a suspended moment, the hall was frozen in silence, as though Jasmine's words had knocked the very air out of the room. Then, like the first drops of rain before a storm, one pair of hands began to clap. Another followed, then another, slowly, deliberately. The rhythm spread until the entire auditorium was rising to its feet, clapping not with frenzy but with weight, a wave of sound that built in steady force, each beat echoing louder than the last. It wasn't the applause of entertainment. It wasn't the reflexive cheer of partisanship. It was something heavier, rooted deeper, as though every person in that room was saying, "We heard you. We believe you. We're with you." The walls of the old auditorium seemed to tremble as the ovation swelled, students standing shoulder to shoulder, professors wiping at their eyes, even security guards shifting uncomfortably as they fought to hide their own reactions. Jasmine didn't bow. She didn't raise her hands to quiet them. She stood still at the podium, her hands resting lightly on the edge, her gaze moving across the sea of faces. She allowed the applause to wash over her, but not consume her. For her, the power wasn't in the noise, but in the stillness that had preceded it. In the crowd, a young woman clasped her hands to her chest as though she were in church. A boy near the front row swiped quickly at a tear before his friends could see. One professor leaned against the wall, whispering, "This is history," under his breath. Phones everywhere recorded, but for once, the technology didn't feel like a distraction. It felt like a vessel, carrying her words further than the walls could hold. The applause seemed endless, cresting like a tide that refused to ebb. And then, gradually, it softened. Jasmine stepped back from the podium, folded her notes, and let her stillness reclaim the stage. She had said enough. The rest belonged to them. But the reach of her words didn't stop at Texas Southern. Hundreds of miles away, in Wilmington, Delaware, a 12-year-old girl named Lariah sat in her grandmother's kitchen, watching the live stream on a small laptop propped between a stack of cookbooks. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, but Lariah hardly noticed. She leaned forward, her lips moving almost unconsciously. As Jasmine's voice carried through the speakers, Lariah whispered the words along with her. "If you want to shake a man who lives on noise, you hit him with stillness." Her grandmother, standing at the counter stirring a pot of soup, turned and saw her. The sight of her granddaughter speaking those words with such quiet conviction made her grip the wooden spoon tighter. She didn't interrupt. She let the moment settle, the screen's glow reflecting in Lariah's wide eyes. The ovation in Houston was still echoing, but here in a kitchen hundreds of miles away, a single child had already claimed the words as her own. That was the twist no headline could capture. Jasmine's power wasn't confined to the stage. It was already seeding itself in the next generation. The applause had barely faded when the counterattack began. At first, it was subtle, a snide comment on talk radio, a sarcastic headline from a fringe blog. But within days, the floodgates opened. Articles began circulating with her photo crudely photoshopped behind prison bars, captions screaming, "The truth about Jasmine Crockett, defender of criminals. It wasn't new information. Not really. She had spent years as a public defender, standing beside people who had no one else to fight for them. But in the hands of her critics, those facts became weapons. Cases were stripped of context, details twisted until they no longer resembled reality. A man she had once defended on drug charges became, in their telling, a gang leader she had personally protected. A teenager she had fought to keep out of adult prison was recast as a violent thug she had set free. The nuance of justice was scrubbed away, leaving only caricature and accusation. The headlines multiplied: Crockett's criminal past. Who is she really fighting for? On social media where doctored memes spread like wildfire. One showed her in a judge's robe with the words, "Let them all walk free," scrawled across the bottom. Another paired her calm face from the Texas Southern speech with a mugshot that wasn't even hers. The truth didn't matter. The image was enough to poison. Inside her congressional office, the phones wouldn't stop ringing. At first, staffers assumed it was more support, more praise. But as they answered call after call, the tone turned darker. She hates this country. She defends killers. Send her back where she came from. The vitriol poured in, sometimes shouted, sometimes whispered with venom, always leaving a residue that clung to the air long after the line went dead. One young intern, barely 19, hung up the phone with trembling hands. "They keep calling her a traitor," she whispered, her voice cracking. Roman, her chief of staff, slammed his laptop shut in frustration. "This is coordinated," he said, pacing the floor. "They're not just criticizing. They're trying to bury her under lies before she can stand any taller." Tasha scrolled through her screen, her face pale. She turned the laptop to Jasmine. On it was a headline from a popular conservative outlet: "Congresswoman Crockett, criminal's best friend." Beneath it, a blurred courtroom photo of Jasmine mid-argument, her expression twisted by a freeze frame into something unrecognizable, almost sinister. Jasmine stared at it for a long moment, her jaw tightening. The weight of years in courtrooms returned to her. The fluorescent lights, the skeptical stares, the knowledge that defending the voiceless would always come at a cost. She looked up, her voice even. "I knew they'd come. I just didn't think they'd come this low, this fast." No one in the room spoke for a beat. The phones kept ringing, online. The headlines kept multiplying. The smear was in motion now, and Jasmine knew this wasn't about truth or justice. It was about whether she could endure the storm long enough for the truth to survive it. By midweek, the pressure inside Jasmine's office was reaching a breaking point. The smear headlines had grown louder, plastered across television chyrons and splashed in Facebook feeds like digital graffiti. Staffers worked with clenched jaws, juggling angry calls from strangers and worried messages from allies. The office air felt heavy, as if even the walls were bracing themselves. Roman was the first to push. He stood in front of Jasmine's desk, papers in hand, his voice clipped with urgency. "We need to sue. Right now. Defamation, slander, libel. We've got options. If we don't fight back legally, they'll define you before you get the chance to define yourself." He tossed the documents onto her desk as if proof alone could force her hand. Greg, her campaign strategist, chimed in next. "We line up a PR blitz, morning shows, podcasts, late-night segments. You tell your side, in your words. Control the narrative before they drown us in theirs." His voice carried the rhythm of a man who had lived through too many scandals, always measuring momentum in hours, not weeks. Even Tasha, usually the calm in the storm, leaned forward, her tone quiet but firm. "We can't stay silent. Jazz. People are confused. They see a headline, they see a photo, and they believe it. If we don't correct the record, we risk losing them." Jasmine listened, her elbows resting lightly on her desk, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. Her eyes moved from one face to the next, absorbing the fear, the urgency, the sincerity. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "No," she said, her voice calm but carrying a finality that stopped the room cold. "We don't waste energy swatting mosquitoes." Roman blinked, caught between frustration and disbelief. "Mosquitoes? Jazz! This isn't some summer nuisance. They're calling you a criminal. They're trying to destroy your credibility before it even forms." "They're trying," Jasmine repeated softly. She tapped her finger once on the desk. "But they don't decide who I am. The people I represent do. If I spend all my time chasing lies, I'll never have time to build truth. And truth is the only thing that lasts." The room quieted, though the tension remained. Staffers exchanged looks, some unconvinced, others silently relieved. They knew her resolve was unshakable, but that didn't ease the weight pressing down on their shoulders. Later that night, long after most of the staff had gone home, Jasmine's phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. She pressed play, expecting another reporter or perhaps her sister. Instead, a trembling young voice filled the room. "Congresswoman, it's Simone. I'm sorry to call so late." The intern's words cracked with nerves. I don't know how you keep standing. I've only been here 2 months and I'm already scared. Scared to walk home after dark. Scared to answer the phones. People yell things, send things. And it's not even about me. It's about being near you." The message trailed off into silence before Simone whispered again, softer this time. "I don't know how you keep standing." Jasmine held the phone against her chest for a long moment. The office was quiet, the city outside her window glowing faintly in the distance. She whispered back, though no one could hear her, "Because sitting down costs more." 3 mornings after Simone's voicemail, Jasmine walked into a cramped conference room in her district office. The blinds were half drawn against the Texas sun, and a row of local reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, their recorders already running. There was no podium, no teleprompter, no grand staging, just a folding table, a plain white backdrop, and Jasmine with a single sheet of paper in her hand. She didn't waste time with greetings. She unfolded the paper, smoothed it with her palm, and looked up. "I've seen the headlines," she began, her voice calm but clear. "I've read the blogs, and I want to set the record straight." The reporters shuffled, leaning forward. The room was quiet enough to hear the buzz of a fluorescent bulb overhead. "Yes, I defended people accused of crimes," she said plainly. "I stood beside men and women who had no one else. I argued for teenagers who had been written off before they'd even had a chance to grow up. I stood in courtrooms where the presumption of innocence was treated like a punchline. That's what public defenders do. That's what justice demands." She paused, letting the words settle. A camera shutter clicked, and I am not ashamed of that. I am proud of it. Because justice doesn't just belong to the powerful or the wealthy, it belongs to everyone. And if that makes me a target, then so be it. At least I know exactly who I am fighting for. She folded the paper, placed it back on the table, and stepped away from the microphone. The entire press conference lasted less than 5 minutes. No fiery retorts, no attacks, no spin, just truth spoken without apology. By that afternoon, the clip had spread far beyond the local outlets. On social media, teachers began reposting it with their own captions. "This is how I explain due process to my students. Justice for all means for all." A veteran in Georgia recorded himself watching her words, nodding slowly before saying into the camera, "That's the oath I swore. To, not to some, but to all." Parents in community forums shared the clip, writing messages like, "Finally, someone said what we've been trying to teach our kids. Fairness isn't weakness." The smear meant to paint her as a defender of criminals backfired spectacularly. Instead of eroding trust, it reminded people of something they had forgotten: the nobility of standing in the hard places, of speaking for those who had no voice. Late that evening, a headline began trending that no strategist could have engineered. It read, Jasmine Crockett, the lawyer America forgot it needed. The phrase caught on like wildfire. It appeared in church newsletters, veterans' blogs, even as the tagline beneath a teacher's email signature. Back in her office, Jasmine watched the headline scroll across a news ticker. For the first time in days, she allowed herself a small smile. The smear had been loud, but the truth had been louder. The Dayton Community Civic Center didn't look like much from the outside. Its paint was chipped. The sign out front leaned slightly to one side, and the parking lot was more gravel than asphalt. But on that Thursday evening, the place was alive with a quiet energy that no big city stage could replicate. Folding chairs had been set up in neat rows under the buzzing glow of fluorescent lights. The faint smell of popcorn oil from the old concession stand drifting through the air. There were no TV anchors, no high-powered donors, no glossy backdrops, just families filing in from work, teachers carrying tote bags stuffed with papers to grade, and seniors arriving early to claim the best seats in the middle rows. A couple of kids darted between chairs before being hushed by their parents. It was the kind of gathering where everyone knew someone, where handshakes lingered and nods of recognition passed silently across the room. Jasmine chose it deliberately. After weeks of smear campaigns and national headlines, she had no interest in the glare of cable studios or the pomp of Washington press rooms. She wanted to be here, in spaces where people didn't expect perfection, only presence. Her staff had taped up a few flyers around town, posted a notice on Facebook, and that was enough. More than 200 people filled the room, some sitting on the edges of the stage, others leaning against the walls once the chairs ran out. When Jasmine entered through a side door, there was no music, no announcement. Conversations simply tapered off until the room settled into an expectant hush. She walked to the front, carrying a single sheet of folded notes in her jacket pocket. Though she already knew she wouldn't use them, she scanned the crowd, worn faces, curious eyes, a mixture of skepticism and hope, and then offered a small nod of acknowledgement. "Thank you for letting me sit with you tonight," she began, her voice carrying easily in the room without need for a microphone. "I didn't come here to talk at you. I came to talk with you." The words landed gently, but they shifted the mood. Shoulders relaxed, heads tilted forward. It wasn't the polished cadence of a politician. It was the steady voice of a neighbor who had walked in from down the street. For the next 15 minutes, she spoke not of national polls or partisan squabbles, but of police reform in neighborhoods like theirs, of housing inequities that forced families into impossible choices, of public schools fighting to do more with less. She painted pictures of grandmothers rationing insulin, of young volunteers followed suspiciously in stores, of children dreaming bigger than the limits imposed on them. Each story was rooted not in statistics, but in faces and names that could have belonged to anyone in that room. The crowd responded not with applause breaks or chants, but with nods, murmurs of agreement, and the quiet hum of people who recognized their own lives in her words. A few whispered "mm-hms" rippled through the rows. Soft but steady, Jasmine stood at the front, her hands clasped loosely before her. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to listen, to answer, to remind them, and herself, that the fight wasn't just in courtrooms or on national stages. It was in rooms like this one, filled with folding chairs and the smell of popcorn oil, where dignity had to be defended face to face. The town hall had flowed easily for nearly an hour. Stories about housing, questions on schools, worries about medical bills. Jasmine responded with honesty and empathy, sometimes sharp, sometimes tender. But then, from the third row, a small hand went up. It belonged to a girl who couldn't have been older than 12, sitting stiffly beside her grandmother. Her braids shimmered under the harsh lights, and her sneakers barely touched the floor. The moderator almost passed her by, expecting the next question to come from an adult. But Jasmine caught the child's raised hand and gestured softly. "Go ahead," she encouraged. The girl's voice was thin, almost fragile, but it carried in the silence. Why do people hate people like us? The words hung in the air like shattered glass. A gasp rose from somewhere in the back. An older man lowered his eyes to the floor. Even the humming of the fluorescent lights seemed louder. The question sliced through policy, through numbers, through party lines, and exposed something rawer than any debate. Jasmine didn't rush to answer. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly on the linoleum, then knelt so she was level with the child's eyes. It was no longer a political event. It was something else entirely, a reckoning of spirit. Elena, right? Jasmine asked gently, remembering the name the grandmother had mentioned when they signed in. The girl nodded, her small hands clasped tightly in her lap. Jasmine inhaled slowly before she spoke. Listen to me, sweetheart. Their hate is not your burden. Her voice was calm but firm, like a steel beam wrapped in velvet. It is not about who you are. It is about what they are unwilling to face in themselves. They hate because they are afraid. Afraid of losing power, afraid of seeing the truth, afraid of what happens when you shine. Elena's eyes flickered, wide and uncertain, but she didn't look away. The crowd was utterly silent, every adult suddenly remembering the weight of being 12 and hearing the world's cruelty too soon. You don't carry that hate, Jasmine continued. You carry your dreams. You carry your brilliance. You carry your right to stand tall. That's yours, and no one can take it. Iri. The girl's grandmother pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. A veteran in the front row dabbed his eyes with a folded handkerchief. What had started as a civic meeting had transformed into something more intimate, less about politics, more about healing wounds no campaign could ever reach, Elena whispered. But it hurts. Jasmine nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. It does, and it will, sometimes. But the hurt isn't proof you're weak. It's proof that your heart is alive, and alive hearts change the world. The crowd exhaled, as though they'd been holding their breath together. Some clapped softly, others simply sat in stunned quiet. A few parents pulled their children closer. The air in the room was no longer tense with frustration. It was thick with connection, an unspoken vow that Elena would not face her question alone. When Jasmine finally rose back to her feet, she didn't return to the stage. She remained among them, shoulder to shoulder, as if to say, leadership is not above the people, it's with them. The town hall ended without ceremony, no campaign banners, no choreographed applause, just neighbors helping fold up chairs and sweep popcorn crumbs from the floor. But one moment refused to stay confined to that little civic center in Dayton. A teenager sitting in the back had recorded the exchange between Jasmine and Elena on her phone. The video was shaky, the sound uneven, but the heart of it was unmistakable. By midnight, it was posted online with the caption, "This is how you answer a child's pain." By dawn, it had crossed 1 million views. Teachers were sharing it before first period. Nurses were replaying it on break room phones. Parents whispered about it over morning coffee, replaying the way Jasmine had knelt, the way her voice cracked without breaking. What stunned people wasn't just her words, but the silence that followed them. The kind of silence that felt heavier than thunder. In a digital world trained to scroll past outrage, this clip forced people to stop. You couldn't half watch it. You had to feel it. Conservative blogs tried their usual spin, accusing her of performative empathy or calling the exchange staged. But the rawness of the child's question cut through every attempt to cheapen it. Even critics began admitting what they didn't expect to say out loud. A radio host known for mocking her paused mid-segment, his voice softer than usual. "Look," he told his listeners, "I may not like her politics, but she didn't answer like a politician. She answered like someone who's been that little girl." That admission traveled almost as fast as the clip itself. People clipped it, repeated it, turned it into memes, but reverent ones, not cruel. The phrase "that little girl" began to trend, not as pity, but as recognition. Recognition of the parts of themselves that had once sat in a too big chair, asking why the world could be so unkind. By the end of the week, School counselors were using the video to start conversations with students. A middle school teacher in Chicago paused class and asked her students, "Have you ever felt like Elena?" Dozens of hands went up. In a church basement in Alabama, an elderly pastor replayed the clip before his sermon, then told the congregation, "This is not about left or right. This is about the gospel of dignity." Jasmine didn't comment publicly. She didn't retweet, didn't issue a press release. Her staff begged her to own the moment, but she refused. "You don't own a moment like that," she told them. "You just let it breathe." And breathe it did. The shaky phone video became something larger than a clip. It became a mirror, held up to anyone willing to remember what it felt like to be small and searching for an answer. The viral spark wasn't spectacle. It was humanity, unpolished and undeniable. And for once, in a season crowded with noise, people didn't just consume it, they carried it with them. The clip of Jasmine kneeling before Elena did not just travel, it rooted itself. By the second week, volunteers in different corners of the country began asking the same question. What do we do with this feeling? The answer came in the form of 3 simple words scrawled on a Facebook post: "We heard her." It started small, as all movements do. In Tulsa, a retired union steward named Frank rented the back room of a labor hall. He borrowed 40 folding chairs, convinced he'd need maybe half of them. That night, 37 people filed in: teachers, custodians, a pair of high school sophomores still in their band uniforms. Some clutched notebooks. Others just carried the heaviness of stories they'd never spoken aloud. Frank stood up, cleared his throat, and admitted, "I don't know exactly what this is, but I know I can't let her words pass without action." Heads nodded. A woman in the second row whispered, "Neither can I." Within a month, the gathering spread like ink on paper. Detroit, Albuquerque, Charlotte, Des Moines, in each place. The format looked different, but the spirit was the same. In Detroit, it was a potluck where elders told stories of walking to segregated schools. In Albuquerque, it was teenagers painting murals with Jasmine's words, "Their hate is not your burden." In Des Moines, a farmer drove 2 hours on a tractor just to sit in a circle and say, "I don't want my granddaughter to ask Elena's question one day." The media tried to label it a movement, a fan club, a flash of political theater. But those who attended the meetups insisted it was none of those. It wasn't about Jasmine as a politician. It was about the quiet dignity in her answer, and the hunger to hear more voices like hers. By the 5th week, more than 20 cities had registered regular meetups under the banner "We Heard Her." They met in church basements, school gyms, even coffee shops that stayed open late. People shared what they carried: grief over lost jobs, fear for their kids, exhaustion from being unheard. Each story was met with the same ritual: not applause, not debate, but silence, the kind Jasmine herself had modeled. Stillness as a form of respect. Jasmine was briefed about the meetups by her staff, who urged her to lean into the branding. She shook her head. "No," she said firmly, "this doesn't belong to me. It belongs to the people who finally felt they weren't alone." And yet, even as she refused to take ownership, she felt the tremor of something larger. This was no longer about a single exchange in a town hall. It was about a country stitching together small circles of honesty, building a patchwork louder than any rally. For the first time in months, Jasmine allowed herself to exhale. She hadn't planned for "We Heard Her," but in living rooms and union halls, in whispered confessions and shared laughter, the phrase was no longer just a hashtag, it was a promise. In the weeks after "We Heard Her" spread, the impact began showing up in places Jasmine could never have predicted. A middle school civics teacher in Ohio sent an email to her office with a snapshot. A chalkboard covered in the words, "Their hate is not your burden." He explained that he had played the shaky phone video during class, expecting a few shrugs. Instead, his students argued fiercely, not about politics, but about dignity, about why someone would laugh at a child for telling the truth. the teacher confessed. I've been teaching government for 20 years, but that clip started the most honest conversation I've ever witnessed. In Chicago, a youth group gathered in a cramped community center with peeling paint and broken blinds. They turned Jasmine's line into spoken word poems, layering rhythm and rhyme over the sting of lived experience. A teenager named Malik stepped onto a makeshift stage, his sneakers squeaking against the wooden floor, and thundered, "You don't bury us in silence. We bloom in it." The room erupted in snapping fingers and shouts of recognition. They weren't quoting a politician. They were reimagining their own futures. Out on the plains of Nebraska, the movement looked different but no less powerful. Farmers who rarely spoke about politics found themselves writing long letters to Jasmine's office. One man signed his note with a smudge of soil across the page, as though he had dropped his pen right after coming in from the field. His words were simple, but heavy with sincerity. "We don't get many women like you out here, but my kids are asking better questions because of you. That matters." Another farmer wrote, "I may not agree with all your policies, but I respect that you stood still when others shouted. That's what my father taught me a leader does." The stories piled up, crossing lines of geography, class, and ideology. A librarian in Arizona organized a display titled "Clear Voices," featuring biographies of women who had spoken truth in hard times, from Sojourner Truth to Dolores Huerta. A veterans group in Pennsylvania hosted a roundtable, weaving Jasmine's stand into their discussions of service and sacrifice. One man, his voice cracked with age, said, "We fought so people could say what's real without fear. That's all she did. And it reminded me why it was worth it." Jasmine read these accounts late at night, alone in her office after the staff had gone home. She lingered on the details: a classroom chalkboard, a smudge of Nebraska dirt, a teenager's poem written in the margins of a math notebook. Each story stretched her message further than she could have walked on her own. What struck her most was that these were not staged rallies or orchestrated campaigns. They were the unpolished, grassroots reflections of people who found themselves changed by a single act of stillness. The movement was no longer tethered to her presence. It was teaching itself to walk, to speak, to grow. For Jasmine, that realization was both humbling and sobering. She had planted no seed intentionally, yet here, across classrooms, farms, libraries, and living rooms, the ground itself had decided to sprout. By early spring, Jasmine decided the movement couldn't just live on hashtags and borrowed microphones. She took a portion of her own campaign fund and quietly redirected it. Instead of glossy ads or flashy consultants, she announced a new initiative: small grants for student leaders. The application was simple, almost disarmingly so. One question printed in bold across the top: what would you change if people finally listened to you? Her staff warned that the idea might flop. Kids were busy, cynical, distracted, but within days the office mailroom was drowning in envelopes, and the inbox overflowed with essays, sketches, even videos filmed on cracked phones. The energy startled them. These weren't vanity pitches or recycled slogans. They were raw visions of futures children were daring to claim. A girl in Detroit wrote about wanting streetlights fixed in her neighborhood so she could walk home from practice without fear. A boy in rural Kentucky drew a plan for a new well, carefully labeling the pipes and pumps, explaining how clean water would change everything for his town. A student in California submitted a poem about silence, not political silence, but the silence of children whose parents worked 3 jobs and never had time to ask how their day had gone. Jasmine sat late into the night reading them, sometimes with tears pooling in the corners of her eyes. None of the responses asked for her to win an election or score points against an opponent. They asked for air that was breathable, schools that felt safe, streets where laughter wasn't a gamble. They weren't writing about her at all. They were writing about the America they still believed was possible. In one envelope, a 12-year-old from New Orleans enclosed a photograph of a cracked basketball court. On the back, scrawled in shaky handwriting, "If people listened, we'd get nets on the rims again." Then maybe kids wouldn't fight as much. They'd play. Another submission from a farm town in Iowa included a single line typed on a library computer. I'd make sure nobody feels invisible. It landed with a weight heavier than any policy memo Jasmine had ever seen. The flood of voices reframed the movement itself. We heard her was no longer about one woman standing firm in the face of ridicule. It was a chorus swelling from every corner, proving that when given the smallest crack of space, people rushed to fill it with vision. Her question had turned into a mirror, and in it, America was catching a glimpse of itself, scarred, weary, but still unwilling to give up. Jasmine realized then that she wasn't carrying a movement. She was simply holding the door open. The responses belonged to the people, to the future they insisted on naming aloud. For the first time since the smear campaigns and hate calls, she felt a sense of relief. If this was what the next generation was daring to imagine, then maybe, just maybe, her fight had been worth it. The spring air in Fort Worth carried a softness that belied the bruises of the last year. Jasmine found herself sitting on a weathered bench in the corner of a neighborhood park, far from the marble steps of the Capitol or the television cameras that once shadowed her every move. She had chosen this spot deliberately, tucked between oak trees and a cracked walking path. It wasn't a stage, it wasn't a podium. It was just a park, and tonight, that felt like sanctuary. Across the court, a group of teenagers shouted over the bounce of a basketball. The rim rattled every time the ball clanged off the metal, but the game didn't stop. They argued fouls, laughed, shoved each other lightly, and reset without anyone keeping score. Jasmine leaned back, arms folded, and just listened. There was something healing in the rhythm, sneakers sliding, lungs heaving, joy returning without permission. One boy jogged past the bench, chasing a loose ball. His hoodie caught her eye. Stenciled on the back in bold white paint were the words, "Clear Voices." It wasn't the kind of merch you bought online. It was homemade, uneven letters, some fading at the edges, yet it carried more weight than any official campaign sign she had ever seen. It meant the words spoken months ago in crowded union halls and tiny classrooms had seeped beyond speeches. They were alive in the marrow of ordinary lives. She watched as the boy lined up for a shot. The ball arced awkwardly, wobbled on the rim, and dropped through. His friends erupted as though it were the game winner, clapping his back, pulling him into a huddle of laughter. Jasmine felt her lips curve into a quiet smile. This, not the noise of political combat, not the headlines twisted by strangers. This was why she had endured. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A dozen unread messages waited. Staff updates, scheduling requests, the next round of obligations. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she lowered her voice, almost as if speaking to herself, but loud enough that the wind could carry it. "Keep playing," she whispered. The words weren't meant as advice. They were permission. For the kids. For herself. For anyone who had ever wondered if joy and resilience could survive the storm of hate. A little girl, maybe 8, wandered over from the swings and plopped onto the bench beside her without ceremony. She didn't recognize who was sitting there. She only wanted to rest. "They play forever," the girl sighed, pointing to the boys on the court. Jasmine chuckled softly. "That's the best kind of forever," she replied. The girl didn't answer. She just kicked her legs, humming to herself, before skipping back toward the playground. The sun began to dip, painting the court in long shadows. Jasmine stood, brushed the dust from her blazer, and lingered for one last look. The hoodie with clear voices blurred into the twilight, but its message burned sharp in her mind. She didn't need applause or cameras or even credit, and all she needed was this reminder. The movement had already left her hands. The call came late in the evening, just as Jasmine was rinsing out a coffee mug in her kitchen. Tasha's voice carried the familiar mix of exhaustion and fire. "You're not going to believe this," she said, barely waiting for Jasmine to answer. "We've got more requests than we can handle. Dayton wants you back. 2 schools in Tulsa, a community college in Ohio, And, get this, even Senator Granger's office called. She wants to have a conversation. The way Tasha lingered on the last phrase made it clear she wasn't sure whether to laugh or shiver. Jasmine let the faucet run and pressed the mug against the counter, her mind already splitting the offers into categories. Town halls she trusted, schools she loved, but an invitation from across the aisle? That was trickier. Still, the fact that someone who once dismissed her as a loud backbencher was now extending an olive branch meant something had shifted. "Tell me what you think," Jasmine asked. Tasha hesitated, then admitted, "It feels like the tide's turning, but don't get swept into their show. They'd love to use you as a prop." The next morning, she sat with her team around a cluttered table, the scent of strong coffee filling the room. Simone, still new but learning fast, leaned in with a trembling kind of urgency. "You could do CNN. You could take the stage at that education summit. Why keep limiting yourself to small halls?" Jasmine listened without interrupting. When the room fell quiet, she finally said, "Because intimacy is the antidote to distortion. The cameras twist, the big rooms echo, but a folding chair in a gym, people hear you as you are." There was no applause, no pushback, just nods that spread slowly around the table. They knew she wasn't chasing the spotlight. She was shaping a kind of politics that couldn't be clipped into sound bites. It wasn't about the size of the room. It was about whether the room could hold honesty. Later that week, Jasmine walked into another school auditorium. The ceilings were low, the lights humming faintly, and the wooden bleachers bore decades of carved initials. She shook hands with a custodian who had stayed late to unlock the doors, with teachers who still wore chalk dust on their sleeves, with students fidgeting in seats that were too small for their growing bodies. She didn't need to scan for cameras because there weren't any. As she spoke, her voice filled the room not with volume, but with steadiness. "This isn't about me. It's about what happens when people stop talking past each other and start looking one another in the eye." She saw the weight of those words land, not as applause, but as stillness, the rare kind that signaled people were truly listening. The senator's invitation remained unanswered on her desk. Jasmine wasn't sure yet if she would accept. For now, she preferred these gym floors and creaking folding chairs. Power, she reminded herself, wasn't measured by the stage you stood on, but by the hearts that carried your words home afterward. The story did not close with fireworks or confetti, but with letters stacked in uneven piles across her desk. Some came on lined notebook paper in the uneven handwriting of teenagers. Others were typed with formal signatures from teachers, veterans, parents. Each one carried a fragment of the movement she never set out to start. A farmer in Nebraska thanking her for making his daughter feel seen. A teacher in Detroit explaining that her civics class now debates courage instead of only memorizing laws. A student in Baltimore writing simply, "I thought I had to stay quiet. Now I know I don't." When she sat alone, she sometimes reread Elena's letter, the 12-year-old whose trembling voice had asked why people hated those who looked like her. In the child's second note, written months later, the handwriting had grown steadier. "I still hear mean words sometimes, but when I do, I think about how you kneeled and told me it wasn't my burden. I decided to try out for student council. I didn't win, but I didn't quit." Jasmine pressed the paper to her chest, as if the ink itself carried warmth. Simone too had grown, though not in letters. She carried herself differently now, with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her footing beside a leader who didn't demand obedience but modeled resilience. Once shy in staff meetings, Simone now interrupted with ideas of her own, urging the team to expand the grants program, to amplify student voices further. Jasmine smiled each time she caught the shift, seeing in her aide what others had once spotted in herself. The courage to stand when silence would have been easier. The montage kept playing in Jasmine's mind. Town halls with popcorn-scented air, students scribbling notes, parents whispering thanks. A teenager in a hoodie with clear voices stitched across the back, running across a basketball court. None of it looked like victory parades. All of it looked like legacy. And yet, when journalists pressed her to claim the win, to declare that she had beaten her critics, she refused. At one small gathering, a reporter asked what it felt like to emerge victorious. Jasmine looked at the rows of folding chairs, at the tired but determined faces watching her, and shook her head gently. "This isn't victory," she said. "It's responsibility." She let the words hang in the air before adding, "Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's strength. And strength means standing when it would be easier to sit down." Those who heard her understood that she wasn't speaking only about politics. She was speaking about kitchens and classrooms, about workplaces and church pews, about every ordinary place where people measured their worth against someone else's dismissal. The final image was not a podium or a headline, but Jasmine walking out into the night air, the city lights glinting off the edges of her coat. She did not wave. She did not linger for cameras. She simply moved toward the sound of life. Children laughing, a bus rumbling, a corner store closing for the night. Her voice, calm and steady, lingered in narration. Wherever they're still asking questions, that's where I'll be.